Hello.
Hello. We get to
Hey, Eric, how are you?
Good. Good.
Yes, we've interacted so many times on Twitter. It's interesting to actually be live and in person.
Yes. Yes. Put a face to the tweet. Yeah.
Yes. So, how are you doing this afternoon?
Good. Good. Teaching this evening, but during the day it's reasonably sane.
Okay. Good. Good.
No dog.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. You mentioned that you had about an hour, which is about
Yeah.
the same
Yeah.
for us. Yeah.
Good.
So, you and I have obviously interacted on Twitter about some of the different issues. I'm sure that you're aware of my position. I think I'm aware of yours, but maybe we can each start by kind of presenting the sort of view. I'd be very happy to let you start if you'd like to explain your position, really just generally on academic freedom, particularly in the UK, and whether you think it's in crisis.
Yeah, I guess I do. I mean, I suppose this issue, I mean, it's most students, most academics are not going to have an issue. I mean, I think it's simply those who are in a political minority or who challenge certain orthodoxies. They're the ones who are going to experience this. It's a bit like, if you're in China, if you don't challenge the regime ideology, you're not going to have a problem. You won't experience any of these chill winds. So, yeah, I think it is in crisis for those who are in the political minority, and I think the survey evidence in the reports that I've done in the UK and North America would show pretty clearly that it's a majority of conservatives who are feeling a hostile environment and also who are self-censoring in the social sciences and humanities. And I do think that's a big problem. Now, so I don't think no platforming is the biggest issue. I mean, I think it's an issue, but I think it's more of a symptom of a problem, which is a much bigger issue for me, which is self-censorship and chilling effects on political minorities.
Right. And so I don't want to jump straight into questions, but I think probably we would both agree on the sort of left-right skew of the professoriate or academia. Most evidence, as you point out, points to the fact that there's more left and liberal folks in academia than there are certainly far right. There's very few far right. There's more sizable representation of conservatives, but perhaps they're in different disciplines or there's different cultures in different parts of the university. So I wouldn't really particularly challenge that. I suppose there's the no platforming issues, which are relatively small number of events, but you're pointing out that there's this kind of chilling effect, and I also don't think I would particularly challenge the fact that students, perhaps some conservative academics, feel like they can't say what they want to say. But I'm wondering where you feel like, on the one hand, what responsibility would people on the left or liberal side of the spectrum have vis-a-vis their conservative counterparts? Because do you want us to change our behavior in some way? And secondly, sort of what would be the evidence that there is, I believe you call this iceberg of kind of like there's the events that take place that are a very tiny number of events that sort of point to this underlying iceberg, but I haven't seen the evidence for the iceberg, I suppose.
Well, the iceberg's more just a metaphor of where the problem is greatest, I suppose. So in a way, the frequency of no platforms is pretty low. It's like 0.01%. If you take the total number of academics in academia in the UK, it might be 100,000 or 500,000 in the US. So that's actually quite a small number of actual events, although I wouldn't want to minimize that because in a way, I mean, I think if we were talking about other kinds of group being no platformed, I think even one or two events of, say, a gay student, a Muslim student, or somebody else being no platform would, and I think rightly, cause a big storm. So I don't want to minimize the no platforming, but to me, that's not the biggest issue. And the biggest issue is, for example, that, essentially even Remain voters would, 70% of them in the social sciences and humanities say that a Brexit voter would not be comfortable sharing their beliefs with colleagues. That's even Remain voters, right? Now, amongst Brexit voters, it's sort of 82%. And in the US, it's even higher for Trump supporters. So that's a huge level of self-censorship. Now, you might say, well, it's just in their imaginations. They're being paranoid. And that's I think it's a fair argument. So what I then also look at in the survey is things such as willingness to discriminate. Now, before I come into these statistics, it's worth saying that it is there's a well-established literature now on political discrimination and effective partisanship. So this is nothing specific to the left. I mean, right and left, individually, right and left discriminate equally. Academics and non-academics discriminate equally. It's more a situation of structurally, when you've got sort of a 10-to-1 ratio, then the discriminatory effect is going to hit so much harder on that political minority. So we've got something like a third of UK academics who reveal that they discriminate against a known Brexit supporter, and in the US and Canada, it's over 40% for known Trump supporters. And it's a significant level of discrimination. But again, it's not because academics are any worse than anyone else or the left is worse than right. It's just a function of the political skew in the faculty. That's all it is.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Oh, well, so there's a couple things I would ask to sort of follow up. Well, one question is, would you recommend, is your goal here to be sort of 50-50 or something, or to be identically representative of the population? Because we don't make these kinds of demands on, say, the police or the military. Why is it significant that there's a political skew? And just because, well, I'll start with that question and then come back to some of the statistics and evidence of self-censorship and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point because, clearly, the ideological balance in the police and the military is not going to be the same as in the performing arts and academia. So I'm not, we're not going to pretend here that this is mainly due to self-selection, right? So most of it's fine. And there's no way it's ever going to mirror, or at least not likely to mirror, the population. That's not the point. The point, however, would be to say, okay, well, two things. One, is academia doing things that are going to chill potential political minorities from entering the profession, number one? And here, I think there is pretty good evidence, and some of which I provide in my recent report for the CSPI, where it just shows that, conservatives are just a lot less, they just are more likely to say their views wouldn't fit in an academic career. They're more likely to, again, report the hostile environment. Essentially, what's happening is that it would be a different situation if, for example, academia was strenuously trying to make a welcoming environment for a politically neutral environment for people of different backgrounds. But that's definitely not what's occurring. What's occurring is, if anything, the reverse. There's an overt progressivism in a lot of departments. I mean, and I'm not going to name the name of a department, but I have seen departments billing themselves as a progressive department. This is something that they're running and sort of leaning into, rather than trying to actually create something that is politically neutral. You have kind of overtly political emails coming from administrators of various kinds, some of which is in the name of equality and diversity, which is very ideological. So yeah, I just don't think there is any effort being made anywhere comparable to, for example, efforts on race and gender, where you have huge efforts, which I think are generally fine. Just trying to widen the pipeline of applicants or whatever it is, that's fine. But there is no effort being made to remedy or to even try and increase representation from political minorities. But this isn't really the main issue for government regulation. The regulation doesn't target necessarily this kind of dynamic.
Okay, so I see. I suppose I see that you're saying that there's not a welcoming environment for conservatives. But that, to me, there's a particular issue, however, around kind of content, and my own research looks at the way the universities, particularly as universities and professions, have started to emphasize science and empirical reality over the course of modernity, that there's this kind of sense that you should refer to facts, and ideology is not really an acceptable basis upon which to make a claim. And yet you're sort of saying that the ideologies should be prioritized in order to make more room for conservatives, regardless of whether their facts and figures are correct or anything like that?
No, not at all. I wouldn't want to ease up on rigor one little bit, but I think if we're talking about the social sciences and humanities, you can be extremely ideological if you are progressive, and that's fine. You would not be allowed to be extremely ideological if you're conservative, and that's fine. And in fact, you can even bend scientific method, the so-called critical studies, whether it be in race and gender. These are not positivist, scientifically based, in my estimation. The claims they make are not generally falsifiable, and yet they're given a pass for political reasons. So if anything, I think the ideological bias is very much in favor of the group that's already in the majority. And there's absolutely no court. So that's not what we're seeking. What we're sort of seeking is, what I would be seeking would simply be a level playing field where you're treating all ideological positions equally. And yes, you can have one set of scientific standards. So you're not going to have QAnon in your department, but equally, I think if you apply these standards to right-wing nutcases, you've got to apply them to left-wing nutcases as well. And I'm just not sure that that's actually being done.
Okay. Well, so from the sounds of it, it sounds like the basis you'd like to make these claims on is a sort of empirical one. So I was just wondering if we could look at some of the actual statistics from your report. This is the Academic Freedom in Crisis report, and I just sort of had a few questions relating to, for example, the 2 to 4% response rate for the North American and British mail vote, which you say has been triangulated against the YouGov survey. So I was just wondering if you could explain that kind of methodology of triangulation in that way.
Well, yeah, we have essentially there are 8 surveys in the study coming from a range of different places. So in the North America case, these were online mail-out surveys to large numbers of publicly available academic emails, and the number of responses that I got was in total about, I think, 1,700 started and filled out the first section, but about 1,100 completes on the US and Canadian numbers. And yeah, so that's only 2 to 4% of the total that I approached. Then I had the YouGov sample, which is, I got 820 off of the YouGov panel. Right. These are people who fill out surveys for YouGov. So they're filling out commercial surveys, other kinds of surveys. So there would be no self-selection. I mean, we were, I think, 61 to 73% of the people who happen to be filling out surveys happen to be academics or have been retired academics, we managed to get. So the chance of significant self-selection bias is pretty low on that. Similarly with the prolific surveys, where it was 72 to 85%. So what we're doing there is I'm trying to get the maximum sample, but I'm using different methods to try and approximate to the population of interest. Now, the other thing is I did a UK online mail out and a UK, the YouGov survey, which is UK as well. So we could compare the results from the online method with a low response rate to the survey platform high response rate to see if there's much difference. And there really wasn't. These surveys are more or less speaking to each other, providing pretty similar results. I mean, within a range.
Right. So I just wanted to share this because I actually studied academics and tried to arrange with YouGov as well. And I've received this email in which we've basically the response from YouGov was that there would be a maximum of 800 academics in the UK, and that this sample would be not representative. So I'm just curious as to know why your YouGov sample was representative when I contacted YouGov and they said this is an impossible thing to do.
Well, I mean, what survey firms do is they send out their survey using their best, it's not randomly sampled. That's what they mean. So they haven't gone through the list of academics and thrown a dart at everyone in 50 or 1 in 100 and kept pestering them till they got a response. I mean, that would be your gold standard method. But, and this is true of poll survey companies in general anyway, is they will survey the population, and then you can weight the survey by key demographics, gender, race, age. So this is a way in which one can then peg these, so they can weight them to the higher education faculty statistics by those variables. Now we can't weight them by willingness to fill out a survey. I mean, that's so. Sure. If there is some sort of bias coming from that, then fine. So yeah, that's I think what they're talking about. They can't do a random sample, but I think the results are, I think if you look at the you can control for gender, for race, for the key demographics.
Well, there's a question here from someone on YouTube regarding the random. Did you say that the YouGov panel is a random sample of UK academics?
No. But what it is not is a convenience sample. So it is people who happen to be there for other reasons filling out surveys. So that unless we have a reason to think that is a sample that in some ways is going to skew our data, these are just people who happen to be there filling out surveys. So it is simply much less susceptible to any kind of self-selection bias. Okay,
and then the claim is that is the same as, for example, the National Association of Scholars survey, which would you suggest that is a selective sample?
Yeah, I mean, that is going to be more, well, as a sample of NAS scholars, I got about 10%. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be self-selection in any sample of 10%. The NAS themselves, of course, people are going to self-select into the NAS who are more concerned in general about academic freedom. So that's true.
Well, because I hadn't actually come across the NAS before, but I believe the report it suggests that they are a group of scholars that have complained about being censored. So isn't that entirely the sample of folks who it's like you've got them all in a room, all of the ones?
No. People are members who are concerned about issues around academic freedom. So they themselves, I mean, you can see in the survey, most of them have, I would say about 45% have had one or more experiences of being threatened or punished for speech, compared to about 15% in the general sample, other general samples that I took. So it's definitely a lot higher. It's not everybody, but yeah.
Okay. Well, because there's another version of, let's see, I'm just trying to find where it was referenced. I think it was page 17, because you refer to, and I believe this was also in the Quillette summary that you posted, where you've compared the NAS survey, which has about 227 respondents, to a UCU survey of 2,300, and then pointed out that there's much more difference. Now, in this experience of disciplinary action, forgive me if I've not read the sort of analysis completely, but are you saying that these are right-wing chilling effects and UCU are left-wing chilling effects?
No, I don't have that level of analysis in that chart. That's simply a summary of the means for those questions across the three surveys of all ideologies. It's just that the share left in the UCU survey is, overwhelming. I don't know, it's maybe 80%, maybe something like 70, 75, or in the EU survey. Whereas the NAS is
Right.
as usual in having 60% conservative. So in terms of increasing a sample size of conservative academics, because really there are so few conservative academics, particularly in the social sciences and humanities at the top universities. So I got only about, I got 43 in my PhD cert sample and about 40 in my US academic sample. So it's pretty small. So I kind of wanted to kind of increase that sample size. Looked at it independently, by the way. So when I say 1 in 3 graduate students and academics in the US has experienced either discipline or threats of discipline, that excludes the NAS survey. So that's 1 in 3 of people on the prolific sample and the online mail out who were conservative. Right. Responded to at least one of the threats that they had experienced.
Now, so when we go back to the surveys that have all been done together, now you're suggesting that, because I believe that the statement here is the result is a triangulated body of replicated knowledge on political discrimination and chilling effects that has not been contradiction and thus no longer should be seriously disputed. So that's saying that because of these surveys that have been done, that they all conform with one another, and therefore there's no basis upon which to be skeptical?
Well, given the current state of knowledge, so the other thing to mention is a lot of these questions were drawn from pre-existing studies of chilling effects, of political discrimination, and the 3 main ones that I list, and they're not the only ones, by the way, are the Inbar and Lammers 2012, Honeycutt and Freeberg 2017, and the Peters 2020. And there are others. I mean, Pippa Norris, who's a leading Harvard political scientist, has done work on this as well. They're all saying the same thing. I mean, basically every single study out there, including the ones I've done, multiple across a number of countries, they're all kind of telling the same story. And at some point, it's a bit like smoking and lung cancer. We've got to actually, I think, recognize the state of the literature. It's up to the other side to come up with something that would change us. There's nothing there so far in the existing body of scholarship that would lead us to believe that political discrimination is not majorly at play, that there's not a significant level of chilling effects and self-censorship going on amongst conservative academics and PhD students. So
I did concede that there's a possibility that conservatives experience chilling effects, but is that possibly because the right-wing media is telling them all the time that they're due to be what I haven't seen is actual evidence of discrimination. Like, would you agree that it's a fairly loaded charge to basically accuse myself, my colleagues, others of essentially discriminating against conservatives when I actually engage with conservatives all the time? I mean, I would sit and eat lunch with them or whatever, like I don't know where the evidence is that conservatives are being discriminated against.
Well, that may be the case for you, Eric, and that's great. And of course, these studies generally don't show a majority of academics are discriminating against conservatives, but the numbers are in the range of sort of between 15 and 45%, all these studies, right? So what I'm saying to you is these studies ask people explicitly, would you discriminate against a right-leaning grant application, journal article, promotion application, hire? And the numbers that we're getting are in the range I've just explained, and particularly on this list experiment, we got between a third and, let's say 40% in the US. I mean, that's a significant amount of discrimination. Individually, if individually 1 in 3 academics would discriminate against a known leaver, if you've got a panel of 4, that's an 80% chance, if you're a known leaver, that you're going to experience discrimination. So you would be crazy to let those opinions slip if you want a job or you want to get promoted. That's my point here. And this is an accumulated body of knowledge that's been replicated in my study, but you can look to others if you don't want to, if you don't like my data, you can look at others' data. And in fact, you can go wider than that and look at the literature on political discrimination in society in general, which is developed. And nothing that I'm finding is especially surprising if you know this literature. And it's not, this is why, it shouldn't be seen necessarily as an indictment of one group of people. This is the way societies are operating in the late or the early 21st century amongst educated people.
Right. Well, so here's Joseph asking about whether you defining conservative academics based off of voting preferences is a pretty narrow basis. So if we're talking about leave versus remain, I mean, if we're talking about a grant application related to something related to leave and remain, but why would a scientist doing biology ever have to deal with that question? That's one. But also in something like the social sciences, in sociology, one of the core texts we have is Max Weber, Science as a Vocation, where he says, it's one thing to have your own political ideology, but you should remove that from your teaching. And the vast majority of my colleagues that I know of do. And we teach both sides and try to, and, I mean, there's the occasional exception, but just because some of us vote for, Joe Biden or to remain or whatever, like, where's the evidence that this actually turns up in the teaching and research?
Well, so there's different bits of evidence. I mean, just in terms of studies that have been done. So one study looked at legal scholarship and used voter registration data to identify the political leanings of the faculty. And the coders were not able to identify who the conservatives were because they kept their views totally hidden in their work, whereas many of the progressives were openly progressive in the way they argued and the way they wrote. And that's, in some ways, I think that's fine. I mean, in a way, I'm not trying to muzzle that, but what I'm saying is there is definitely not a equal standard here. And in fact, in the survey questions, you could see we asked people if they would discriminate against a left-leaning grant application, left-leaning paper, and so on. Now, those on the right would, by the way, at similar rates as those on the left who discriminate against the right. It's just there's very few of them. So if you take, for example, left-wing academics, they're just not likely to the data shows they're not going to discriminate against a left-leaning paper. So it's not about having a left or a right lean. There is a much more pronounced discrimination against a right-leaning paper than against a left-leaning paper. And it's not because, again, the left-wing academics are any worse. They're doing the same thing the right-wing does, but they're just a lot more numerous. So their views carry a lot more effect, a lot more clout.
Well, so the one thing I would concede is sort of if there's a greater number of left-wing academics, the probability of a handful of obnoxious left-wing people confronting a conservative at some point in their career is higher because of the number. But that's a kind of like a microaggression building up to some kind of fear of kind of speaking out because you never know if. But that's kind of like a very difficult thing to control. So I do kind of wonder what you're asking people, the vast majority of academics who don't discriminate. Like, what do you want us to do?
Well, okay, so there's a couple of things. I mean, the first is there's two parts to this problem. One is what I call hard authoritarianism, which is the disciplinary action and the threats and the procedures that universities have, which chill. Okay, particularly if they violate the duties to uphold academic freedom, which a lot of the harassment policies and a lot of the issues around policies in work and study do, and I think Civitas's study showed that pretty clearly. So a lot of policies are not compliant in terms of violating academic freedom. But yeah, so essentially academics need to know that they cannot be, that essentially if a mob blows up on Twitter to go after them or students complain against them, their university is going to have their back and isn't going to give in to pressure sort of that kind. So that's, I think, critical, that if you can take away the chilling effect coming from administrative punishment, That's at least going to get us part of the way. It's still not the majority of the problem, but it's going to get us part of the way. Now, in terms of the political discrimination chill, if universities made it pretty clear that you were not in any, whether you were refereeing a research grant or paper, or whether you are hiring or promoting, that you have to be just as conscious of political bias as of race and gender bias, for example. If that were the case, and if departments and universities made strenuous attempts not to be political, I'm not saying academics should be free to be as political as they want. I'm talking about officials, people in an administrative capacity, speaking in an administrative capacity, sending emails to an institution should not be political and ideological. And now, if those efforts were being made, then I'd say, well, then they're making the efforts they can make, and we're getting the people that we're getting, and there's a skew, and that's it. We're just going to have to live with that, and that's fine.
Well, so what about things like there is, because so you're saying academics should be completely free to teach and research whatever they want, but that's, to me, I'm going to put that aside because there are things that are not true that I don't think professors should teach. But I'll put that aside for now. You're suggesting that the administrators should not do things like follow through on the Equalities Act, which is a legal requirement, or something like prevent. Do you think that universities should not be fulfilling their legal requirements? That's something you.
No, so the question then becomes one of what is the relative priority of these requirements, right? So equalities versus prevent versus academic freedom. And so in the white paper, for example, the emphasis is very clearly that those academic freedom duties come first, and these other duties are subsidiary to that. Up until a certain point, there are trade-off points, obviously, in all of these things, which are decided in the fine points of law, but essentially, the threshold for, let us say, some student complaint, if it doesn't meet the threshold, it simply should be desk rejected. That would be so. If we're serious about dealing with chilling effects, frivolous complaints that have no chance of meeting the legal threshold, that the universities have to abide by the legal threshold, not make up their own thresholds. And similarly with prevent, by the way, the universities overdo it on prevent. They should not be. The academic freedom has to come first. It's only if it meets a very high standard of prevent, some sort of a violation in terms of prevent, that it should be acted upon. So again, I think in many ways, universities are, I think, simply not upholding that standard of academic freedom that is to some extent already there in the legal guidance, but is going to be even more clear in the new and updated guidance.
Right. And so would you say, for example, let's imagine that the government, and I don't think that this is completely imaginary, let's say that the government put a ban on critical race theory in UK universities and said you cannot teach that. Would it be the responsibility of both the academics and the administrators to make sure that critical race theory was taught, if that's what the academics and students and the discipline wanted to teach?
Well, so I think that a ban on critical race theory outright, I just think that would be a violation of academic freedom. So okay. I just think it's a non-starter. And in fact, academic freedom also protects left-wing speech as well. If you're studying Israel in the Middle East or whatever, if you are thrown into tribunal on the basis of some purported prevent violation, you can go to the ombudsman and you can appeal outside your university's procedures for redress. And so this actually is going to help anybody whose academic freedom is being infringed on the basis of a sort of bogus reading of the law, basically. Because universities are not held to an interpretation that is in line with the law right now.
Right, but you're suggesting that unpopular political opinions should be protected, and then also that a viewpoint diversity should be made to be more or less equal in different situations, like presented. So I'm just assuming that you're defending the rights of conservatives, because perhaps there's some folks that you might know or yourself that might want to present some views. But if we're making an in principle claim for academic freedom, you would also say that critical race theory should be presented anytime that a view is presented that's the opposite of that.
No,
So,
no.
like, for example, if someone wants to say the British Empire was a morally good thing, or if you're a gender critical scholar and you want to say that trans women are not women, it should be required that the viewpoint diversity is brought to bear and the opposite position is presented as well.
No, not at all. What I would say though is that there should not be a compulsory. So it should not. We should not have compulsory training or compulsory teaching in something like any one of those. Anything that's taught as the truth, and that you must go and you must undergo this training or whatever. I think that's wrong because people have freedom of conscience. They should be allowed to opt out of these things without any kind of penalty. But no, I'm not saying I think a panel can be all one view. That's absolutely fine. I'm not saying some kind of enforced viewpoint diversity. No.
Okay. So this is an issue, for example, with say Stonewall has a position regarding trans rights, which is a function of the equalities law. So it is external as well. But I'm just confused as to what is the problem with universities kind of making a case that they want tolerant workplace. So for example, in your survey questions, I can't find the exact point, but there's a sort of a position that diversity is wrong or
it's a hypothetical case. A hypothetical case.
Yeah. I was just trying to locate it. I can't find it, but it was a question about if someone thought that diversity was wrong, right? And whether you would sit.
No, if a scholar reported that.
What would be the argument that diversity is wrong? I'm just confused as to what.
So if a scholar of organization, so it's one of the hypothetical 4 cases for the dismissal campaign. If a scholar reported that organizations with a higher share of women and minorities had lower organizational performance, that was the hypothetical. And I'm not, this is not something that I'm endorsing. I'm just saying I came up with a bunch of what I thought were controversial positions modeled loosely on real world examples of this case. Would you favor a campaign to dismiss the scholar that reported these findings? That's sort of what it was about. And so you had something like 13% in the UK and 18% in the US who favored dismissal. And it's actually quite a small share, and in the other examples, it was sort of under 10%. So, one of the points is that there is actually a very small share that are actively in favor of cancel culture in the professoriate, in the faculty.
Right. So, so there was a very specific question that was asked of these folks, but so you have empire as positive, restrict immigration, and then there's various points who would support to remove them. But then the iceberg thesis is that there's a higher percentage that would not eat lunch and things with these folks.
Yeah. Right. So in the US and Canada, in the social sciences and humanities, I was getting only about under 30% who said they'd be comfortable having lunch with essentially a gender critical feminist, and about 40% for a Trump supporter. And in Britain, those numbers are all higher by a little amount. So I think 53% comfortable with a Brexit supporter and somewhere in the 30s for gender critical feminists. So majority not comfortable, except for the Brexit supporter, majority not comfortable.
So so not sitting like, so for example, the reason I wanted to ask about the diversity or pro-empire claims is, can you imagine being, say, not just a left-wing academic, but say an ethnic minority, and finding out that someone thinks that the empire was great, or being a transgender person and finding out that the person is transphobic? Is that really like being discriminatory of their ideology, or is that just being aware of the person's discrimination against them?
Well, okay. I mean, I think in those cases we might be more understanding of someone not wanting to sit down with somebody, but that's, those are not the majority or even a small minority of the sample. So we're just talking.
Which sample is this? Which sample?
Any of them, either the YouGov or the online mailouts. That it's
the lunch survey. Which was that?
Both.
The YouGov?
The question was asked on all those, on almost all the surveys. So, but the online, the North American online survey, we got under 30% saying they would be comfortable. And this is not trans people. I mean, these are just standard academics. So there may be the odd trans person in there, but it's not going to affect the sample.
Okay. So it would seem to me that, as a social scientist, that a truly mixed method analysis, like a triangulated method, would interview some of the folks that are making these claims that they're not going to eat with someone, for example. Like, have you interviewed anyone who said, we won't sit with a gender critical feminist, and explain their reasoning behind that?
No. I think this is survey research operates like this, Eric. I mean, people conduct. It's already a pretty extensive body of questions, and yeah, I mean, the goal. It would be lovely to follow up and find out, do focus groups and find out exactly how people interpreted every question. But that's, I think, above and beyond the call of duty in this case.
And so this is the North American survey.
Yeah. And
it's sort of saying comfortable sitting with a trans-critical. And so this is a Trump voter is actually not comfortable sitting with a trans-critical.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's about, what is it, 48? I can't read it from there, but I mean, it's a lot higher than a Clinton supporter at 25, but it's still not a majority. So yeah, that's right. It's not just the left that's implicated in this sort of discrimination against gender critical feminism.
Right. So what I might do is, because I've obviously asked you a lot of questions, so maybe I can, if you wouldn't mind, there's some folks asking some questions from the different points of. So let's see. There was a question earlier about things like race science and different bits that were kind of, well, actually, here, I'll start with Liz Moorish has this question. The policy exchange report suggests the teaching and research seminars might operate under Chatham House rules, and that this might hinder free exchange of ideas if discussion cannot continue out of class. Do you have any thoughts on this question regarding, on the one hand, it might improve things, but also, are there potential unintended consequences of limiting discussion in other directions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and maybe that negative outweighs the positive of making people feel more comfortable about being open with their views. So I guess it's a question around sort of tweeting or screenshotting or recording or in some ways reporting on what happened in the class, which might be chilling. I mean, a lot of the Heterodox Academy latest campus survey showed something like 60% of students were concerned about what their fellow students thought, and were reluctant to be open with their views for that reason. So would this make a difference? It might make enough of a difference. I think people can still talk about ideas outside of class, but just not in terms of recording or in some ways quoting verbatim what went on in the class. I think that just might be so. It shouldn't actually hinder discussion, but it might hinder publication, for example, or speaking leaks to a reporter, for example. So you should still be able to discuss outside of class.
Okay. And so here's Hitchcockian. Sounds like the target should be the reputation management policies of universities, and why is the target kind of like these sort of woke academics and so forth, and not the university administrators that seem to be the ones who you seem to have an issue with?
Well, the administrators are the problem. I mean, they are responding and reacting to what's happening on Twitter, what's happening in terms of internal complaints. The problem, in a way, is the complaints and the Twitter activity is coming from the, essentially the woke, or if you like, left modernist activism, and that's the sort of initial cause, and then the university is refracting that through their reputation management policy, their policy in work and study, these other sets of policies, which they then interpret in such a way as to clamp down on free speech or to chill speech. So I agree that absolutely reputation management is something that it needs to be made clear that is secondary to academic freedom when the two collide, that cannot be used as an excuse to abridge the academic freedom rights of staff and students. So I think this, and this is abused, I think, by the thing is there's no scrutiny of how universities weigh up their competing obligations, and typically academic freedom, even though they have policies on it, simply falls by the way. It gets trumped by other priorities such as reputation management. I think with the auditing of universities, that should hopefully come to an end.
Right. And so there's a lot of questions about lunch, I've got to say.
Maybe because it's lunchtime now.
So here, why does it matter whether some academics want to have lunch with other? Like, isn't there a sort of freedom that we should have where we don't have to eat lunch with people if we don't like them?
Okay, so you're right. I mean, of course, people have freedom of association. I think I've mentioned elsewhere, if you are a Foucauldian and you want to hang out with the Foucauldians, then, you should be able to hang out with the Foucauldians. That isn't really the point. I suppose this is a way of simply saying, well, would you actively exclude? It's one thing not to want to, not to be, that your first choice might be to hang out with those of your own, and you shouldn't be compelled to do otherwise. But I suppose the issue is if you would exclude someone on the basis of, it's color, creed, and religion, and this is a kind of creed, right? So I think it would be wrong to actively exclude. I think it might not be your first choice of who to go to lunch with, but I think it is revealing that there's a very high share that would not be comfortable. I mean, I think that it's very much similar to other kinds of questions around sort of where would you want to live, who would you want to be friends with. Of course you have freedom to associate with who you want to associate with on any basis, but it would be nice if you didn't feel scared of the other, if you like. I mean, if you might at least be willing to do it once in a while, not every day.
Right. Well, I suppose it does still go back to the question of, you would expect a black colleague to sit with a colleague who thinks the empire was a good, morally good thing, because of they should be tolerant of their ideology.
Well, I mean, ideally, I think it would be a learning experience for each to hear from the other. I think that would be a better situation, actually. But of course, the number of black academics in my surveys is not large. It's not what's driving.
Is that perhaps because there's not a lot of black academics in general?
Yes.
Because of racism.
I mean, of course. Because of what?
because of institutional racism. I mean,
well, no, I would dispute. I would dispute that as the reason. No, but there are not that. There isn't a large share of Black academics. I
in the UK,
in the UK and in the US too.
Right, and so why would that be?
Well, I mean, it's the same question as asking why do some groups choose certain disciplines more than others? Why are there more women in psychology and veterinary science and more men in engineering? Why are there more Asians in being doctors and lawyers than being historians? I mean, these are
right. So there's some scholars who would say that on those questions of why are there more women in science or in humanities versus science, some would say that's because of biology. Would you say that that's a reasonable claim to make? I mean, the evidence is against that.
I'm not an expert on this. I think it's definitely an input, but whether it's a small share of the explanation or a larger share, I'm just not qualified to say. I mean, I think that what's clear is there are different choices made by different ethnic groups.
But isn't there different choices made by conservatives that, like, a lot of them might just choose to go into banking and not academia? So why would you want us to correct for those decisions and not correct for, say, the decisions of Black scholars not to go into philosophy departments?
Well, I would want to have whatever, if we can imagine a situation where natural choices, sort of the choices that are made that are sort of uncoerced, lead to, a sorting of different genders and ethnic groups into different departments. Similarly with politics, you would have a natural inclination whereby people who are high in the Big Five trait of openness, which would tend to be more people on the left, would tend to select more into academia. I think that's perfectly reasonable. The question is, what should the distribution be? The problem is the distribution in 1960 was about 2-to-1 left to right, and it's now sort of 6-to-1. It was actually 1.5-to-1. And so it's not just a question of psychological profile selecting into higher education.
But where do you so I'm just going to push you on this because we only have so many minutes left, but where's the evidence that this isn't just the fact that conservatives have not been making good ideas? Like, why has the shift from 2-to-1 left right to 6-to-1 left right? Where's the evidence that that's because the left wing has pushed conservatives out? And not just simply conservatives chose to abandon the academy and work for think tanks and work for Wall Street and work for any other employment other than academia. And why is this credited to discrimination? And the second question is, why is that something I just need to accept, but I shouldn't accept the theories of critical race theory and other feminist scholarship that would say that the same patterns in those fields are due to sexism and racism. Like, it's one thing if you accepted one but not the other, but it strikes me as, why be skeptical of the race and sexism argument but expect me to sort of have no skepticism for the conservative argument?
Oh no, I want full skepticism. It's all about the evidence. So, for example, if you ran a survey that asked people, would you not hire a female or a Black scholar for a job, and you got, revealed, if in a list experiment, you got 40% of people saying they wouldn't hire a Black person for a job, I would be, wow, that is just hugely problematic, and we've got to do something about this now, right? So, essentially, we don't have anything like that evidence for these other categories. And incidentally, by the way, there's also there's a whole bunch of research on how essentially political prejudice is much more overt, much stronger, particularly amongst educated people.
But isn't that because that's not a protected characteristic? I mean,
political
preference is not. It's like that's content.
The European Court has. One of the European Court's rulings recently is you can't just discriminate on the basis of somebody's political, affiliation. I mean, this is not something you're allowed to do. So it is actually protected in law. We can argue about how if it's properly protected in the UK or not, but no, it has a status. I mean, I think so. What I'm saying to you is there are testable ways of falsifying the discrimination hypothesis. I mean, if we did a list experiment, and so I did. One of the questions I asked is whether you discriminate on a right-wing term paper in marking, and I got a really low share of something like 7%, which is pretty negligible in my view. It's not serious. So yeah, I think in terms of marking, I don't think we have a problem. I do think we do in terms of grant applications and hiring. The other thing is in terms of the chilling effects. I mean, the survey that I did on master's and PhD students showed that the conservative master's and PhD students said that their beliefs would be less likely to fit in academia, and they also were no different in terms of their views on whether academia was attractive or unattractive due to pay or isolation. So some of the things which affect whether people are willing to go into academia didn't really distinguish conservatives from the left. It was only around this question of whether their beliefs would fit with academia, that the political beliefs, that we saw a big differentiation.
But I said right from the start, and I realized that we probably have to wrap up relatively soon, but I can see that conservatives do think this and feel this. But again, just using an equivalent example, if a black academic thought that their institution was institutionally racist because they don't see other black people in their workplace, would you consider that to be a justifiable fear?
Yeah, I mean, well, in combination with evidence of discrimination. So
which there is actually quite a lot in the case of ethnic discrimination.
Well, I'd need to see the studies. So I'd need to.
I mean, please.
No, well,
there's so many.
I can believe
you want me to run a JSTOR on the amount of ethnic minority discrimination that takes place in academia. Seriously?
I would need to see the studies, Eric. I mean, what I would say to you is I can believe that some of it does take place, partly as a result of who people decide to associate with at the micro level. But if you take in terms of the overt discrimination, I don't think that it's there in terms of. So if
there's no overt discrimination for conservatives either.
There is, of course, there is. 40% of people.
That's latent.
On the surveys, they're admitting openly,
that's latent.
25 to 40%. I mean, that's huge. Okay, if there was anything even remotely approaching that in a survey for black or female academics, I mean, there would be enormous, and rightfully so, enormous action to try and get that to zero. There's no actual action on this. It's not considered a problem. All I'm saying to you is,
but it goes back to the question of,
yeah.
You've got the surveys, you've got the question about whether people would sit and feel comfortable sitting with transphobes, and people are saying that they wouldn't. But that doesn't. I mean, how is that an academic freedom? I mean, there are students. Okay, let's use the example of gender critical scholars, and I'd like to just mention briefly that next week we do hope that Kathleen Stock can join us, because
people are all busy though.
Well, there's this. I do appreciate you coming on. I really do. I do really want to have more of these conversations, because I don't want people to feel like they can't say what they think, and I don't feel like I think that academia is open and tolerant, including of conservative voices. So
I don't. It is, yeah. For the most part, it is.
But equally, I don't really want the public to think that we're a bunch of hostile anti-Tories or whatever. And I think many of us might be in our private lives, but I also think that that's acceptable. So I don't want to get too hung up on any one point, but if we're talking about a gender critical, trans critical academic and people not wanting to associate with them, now I can see how that making that decision to become a transcritical academic is essentially asking to enter a small group of people who think the same way, because the vast majority of people don't think that way. And that's not just in academia, that's actually the public as well. Think that being trans phobic is like being racist. That's why people don't want to say that they're being racist. I mean, I think it's acceptable to say I'm biased against conservatives because you could be biased against conservatives. That's not something that is protected in any way. I don't think
I don't think it's
political
okay.
bias, but you don't have to sit and eat lunch with them.
Well, okay. I think first of all, I would take issue with some of the characterization of gender critical feminists. But what I would say is that you don't have to eat lunch. But look, we're talking about active exclusion versus not choosing to socialize with somebody every day. I mean, there is, I think, an issue if you think it is okay. If you kind of self-justify some of these political prejudices, I do think that's a problem. I think there's a good paper out recently on essentially showing and arguing that being politically biased against somebody for their ideology is a problem of the same order as being politically biased against somebody for their religion. I mean, you can caricature in a one-dimensional way their beliefs as being extreme, and that anyone who's conservative is essentially a QAnon. Anyone who's gender critical hates trans. I mean, you can have these kind of.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what about calling people on the left woke sorcerers and using? I mean, isn't that an unfair? If this is a religious level discrimination, isn't it a bit intolerant of the opposed side, the woke side, to keep calling them woke, for example?
Well, I didn't call the left woke. That's not what I didn't call the left woke. I mean, we're talking about groups of people who are progressive, authoritarian in the sense of being intolerant of different views, is what I'm referring to. Woke is actually, I think, it's not the term. I mean, technically, I would use the term left modernist instead of woke. Essentially, that refers to those who would sacralize historically disadvantaged race, gender, and sexuality categories. I mean, that is essentially what woke means. That's a hell of a mouthful, though, to go through each time. I think it is a concept. It is a concept that can be measured, tested, and falsified.
Well, okay. I'm not sure that woke could. So I mean I tend to agree, and maybe this is worth leaving here because I think we could pick this up again, and I'd be really keen to just debate this more often in the future. But I agree with you that this is actually essentially a religious controversy. This is a moral and ethical debate, and this is why people don't want to sit and socialize with people they find ethically dubious. But I do think that goes both ways. And I think you're probably right that the reason this hits academia is because there are more left-wing people, and therefore the right-wing people feel that much more isolated because there's fewer of them and they have to confront more left-wing people. But in society, the opposite is the case. And so I'm just as concerned for people out in the world that are suffering the opposite forms of discrimination. But if we are genuinely going to resolve this without, for example, bringing the government in, which is really where I do think it's not a crisis that warrants government intervention, but we can debate that separately. If that was the case, that it was essentially a religious, moral, ethical conflict, there's no way that we'll get through this by calling each other names. I think that you need to get to the source of the ethical claim, and I don't think that woke is a methodological or empirical concept. I think it's an epithet, just like social justice warriors or whatever else.
Well, I think people have, in terms of in some of the speech that they have in discussions of the extreme wing of the other side. I mean, I think when you're dealing with an extreme wing, I mean, there's going to be humor, but I agree with you. If you want to have an in-depth discussion that's sober, I would prefer the term, essentially left modernist extremist is the way I would tend to put it, or perhaps those who have sacralized identity categories, and therefore anything that might imply any sort of giving of offense or anything to, putative giving of offense to these categories must be seen as blasphemous. I mean, I think that is sort of the way I would analyze that strand. But I mean, I do think woke, in terms of signifying that sacralization process, it's not just an epithet. I think it is a term that describes something conceptual. But I think the concept I would use is maybe something like, left modernist, for example.
Okay, well, I don't want you gave us an hour, and I'm very, very appreciative of that. So and again, I do appreciate you coming on to debate this, because you've obviously gotten quite a lot of attention for your report. So I'm pleased to have had the chance to ask you more questions about it, and hopefully put names and faces and so forth.
Well, thanks for initiating, Eric, and another time.
Okay.
Take it easy.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Free speech.
Life.